I'm gonna unmute.
It's better unmuted.
Oh,
Oh,
hey, how are you? Welcome back.
yes.
It's been a year and I haven't seen you or talked to you at all.
It's been quite the year.
Yeah, but anyway, I'm glad we're back, and I think we have last year we had five live streams. I think October is a longer month, but this time we have four, and four pretty good ones.
I wish.
Um, right? We have sports, where I'm just going to be a silent supporter. We have humanitarian aid, where I'm going to speak a lot.
Okay.
We have disrupting the Caribbean, where I'm going to speak little. So that's the plan. So what else has been happening? This came out.
Oh, what is it? Oh, wait.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
We started this last year as all these things were brewing, and I'm so excited that the Decolonize Hipsters is out. How has it changed your life?
Well, I think it's changing the lives of hipsters around the world. It's been nice. Good, feedback, and people who read it appear to like it. So that's it's a nice feeling.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, very nice.
I hear you've been doing things as well. The Radical Books Collective.
Yeah, that's been awesome. And in fact, the person helping us today in the back is Pritika Nanda, who's producing the show. So so I'm glad about that. Yeah, Radical Books has been good. It started more experimentally in the spring, and then we kind of got off Eventbrite and then went on a website. And the idea is to have book clubs that amplify bold, new, politically difficult sort of voices. It's I don't want to I don't mind loosely using the word decolonize, as opposed to everyone reprimanding others about saying don't say decolonize, it's a buzzword, it means nothing. But it's a kind of, Radical Books Collective is a kind of decolonize your bookshelf, if you will. Kind of buy other books, read different books, think about small presses, think about indie presses, get off Amazon, that kind of thing. So it's been good, and we are in early stages, but it's been good.
Yeah, good conversations, good writers, good guests, good hosts. I recommend it.
Exactly. So here we are. We have Sandy Grande and Ernest Whiteman III in the studio. And Greg, do you want to say a little bit about what we have planned?
Yeah, I think it's fitting. This is the week of De-Columbus Day, as I like to call it. I think it's changed names now, but and changed focus. But there's something to be said about this, right? I mean, that has long lived in infamy, I would say, and that has been sort of turned around, or at least people have tried to turn around to actually refocus on the whole of the Americas. So it's fitting. We're going to be talking about representations of Native Americans, Native nations, First Nations. So with Sandy and Ernest. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting time for this as well, right? In the past few years, there's been a lot in sort of national news about Native Americans. A lot of representation, quite literally, right? I mean, the last elections I've seen Deb Haaland and Shanice Davis, I believe, being elected, the first two Native American women. Deb Haaland is now Secretary of the Interior. So yeah, that's quite literally or seemingly maybe a moment for Native representation.
Yeah, but I also want to add a disclaimer, which is that this is not how we planned it, right? Actually, Sandy and Ernest were to come in the third week of October. I just feel like everyone thinks, oh my God, look at these people, fitting the exact category of guests to the upcoming week. But yeah, it's good. This is the October opportunity at the end of the day, right? At least in the US. Okay, so let's roll to our other thing. Pritika, will you play the little bio of Ernest and Grandy that we made? and Sandy Grande that we made.
Heavily the skies got changed for salvation. Running out the door of the old gas station. He makes it to the pump and say don't ask no question. Quick get into the car, we're heading for redemption. I want you to see how nice the springtime can be. He slams the door through the gum on the floor.
Welcome, Ernest and Sandy. Thank you so much for joining us on our crisp October morning here in the Northeast, at least. Greg, do you want to quickly read out a little bit of Ernest? I'll do the same for Sandy.
Of course. So Ernest Whiteman III is a Northern Arapaho filmmaker, artist, writer, and media educator from the Wind River Reservation and currently lives in Skokie, Illinois. He is the author of a short stories collection, The Autobiography of a Blue Woman, as well as her first novel, A Res Tale. He is at work on many film and video projects, 10 in 10, a documentary series, and an indigenous people's history of the zombie war, an urban native horror movie. He's the director of First Nations Film and Video Festival Incorporated, a nonprofit film festival supporting Native American directors of all skill levels and finding venues to help them express their views and screen their movies. Ernest teaches at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside and is a teaching artist with the Chicago Arts Partnerships in Education. He is currently working on a film adaptation of Hamlet, which will include a full cast of Native American actors.
Nice. And I will say Sandy Grande is my friend and my colleague at Connecticut. And she is a professor of political science and Native American and Indigenous Studies at UConn with affiliations in American Studies, Philosophy, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Across her work, she aims to produce nuanced analyses of the colonial present. She was recently awarded the Ford Foundation Senior Fellowship for a project on Indigenous elders and aging. Her book, which is absolutely brilliant and is today 10 years old this year, is called Red Pedagogy, Native American Social and Political Thought, and was published in a 10th anniversary edition and a Portuguese translation in Brazil, or rather it's forthcoming, I think, this year. In addition to publishing numerous articles, book chapters, she's a founding member of New York Stands for Standing Rock. As one of their projects, they published the Standing Rock syllabus. And in addition to her academic and organizing work, she has provided elder care for her parents for over 10 years and remains the primary caregiver for her 93-year-old father. Okay. Everyone, welcome. And Greg, let's start with some of the questions we had in mind for them.
Okay, so I started with a kind of a bad pun about representation, with political representation, but that's also a great transition. And I thought, I was wondering if you could maybe start with that topic, right? I mean, I've noticed sometimes in classes, especially with young people, they don't necessarily have the same understanding of the tradition of American tradition of Native American representation. So I was wondering if you two could maybe backtrack a bit and discuss what that's about. Like what has it been like, representation of Native Americans in this country?
Well, I guess I can take a stab at that. Well, the way I always put it is, I always ask people to imagine. Imagine that someone you meet has already made up their mind about you. Mm-hmm. Already decided all these things about you, even before they meet you, even before you were even born. And so they've already decided that, oh, you're Native American, then you must be poor. Oh, you're Native American, oh, you must have been in jail. Oh, you're Native American, oh, you must be alcoholic or dealing with some sort of substance issue. There's all these things that they've already decided even before they greet you and talk to you. They expect you, oh, you're Native American, then what can you teach me spiritually? Oh, you're Native American, then you must be able to, you're going to give me something culturally, right? There's a cultural cost for my interaction with you. So I always ask, where does that idea come from? And the great Mark Charles actually pointed it out quite succinctly. It's right embedded in the foundations of our country. Declaration of Independence carries a savage Indians remark. They didn't even count us as citizens of this country until 1924, and even then, that's given off more of a privilege than a right, something that they could grant us rather than that we already had. So, if a country is established, if that's the bedrock foundation of a country, that they see you as this violent, merciless Indian savage, how do you think generations and generations of people are going to be viewing you, especially citizens of this country? So the representations of natives constantly reflected that. In newsprint, it was always about the Indian War, so there was an attachment of violence at all times. Then as the Indian War started to wane, the idea of vanishment started to take hold. So it's always between the two V's in any native representation. We're either violent or we're vanishing. And so imagine growing up with media that depicts that about you constantly for generations and generations and generations. So when I meet anybody, they're already going to have an idea about me before they even greet me.
Yeah.
So,
Sandy, do you agree, or is there something you wanted to add there? Or?
Yeah, I think that's a great, Ernest, lovely to see you and everybody. So appreciate being in this space with y'all. I think the only thing I would add is particularly, I think, significant here on the East Coast, where the genocidal project began literally right down the road with the Mystic Massacre in Mystic, Connecticut. So the cadastral effacement is so profound that the only thing I would add, to kind of Ernest's litany of, oh, then you must be an alcoholic, or you must be this, or you must be that, is what you often get here is, I thought you were all dead. And so there's literally, and very genuinely, people don't think natives exist anymore. I think that's one thing that I think most recently, maybe Standing Rock in particular, helped to mitigate, because it's the first time in a long time, most people might have seen Indigenous peoples on broadcast news. I mean, in this very spectacularized way, but and so for folks who thought everybody was dead already, that's sort of that's the baseline, which is pretty profound when you think about it.
I think that I think that also represented another shift towards recognizing that natives are still around, as opposed to I thought you're dead question, but the reaction to it was still very very one of attachment towards violence. Film has done anything for native representation, it's guaranteed a violent reaction to native movements. Because John Wayne was always the hero, and his actions towards the natives are remarkably violent. And if you love John Wayne out there, don't ever look up his view on Native Americans, because that will just spoil your day.
Oh gosh. So I think part of the way we planned this was because, I know, we have been seeing, at least in the past, I think 2 years, maybe the pandemic has exacerbated the amount of time we are spending online or on TV or whatever. But the last few years there has been a proliferation, some of this, of representation or depiction on TV, film, literature. Some of this is also cosmetic. These seem like cosmetic changes. Some of it is, Native Americans in government, all the stuff coming out of Standing Rock, and then more recently, of course, in the news with the awful expose of what was happening in the Canadian orphanages. So that's one, of course, version of the shift. And I'm going to share my screen quickly to show you, where is this? Yeah, window. So I don't know if you can see. No, you can't see it. I don't know why. I just had made a tiny collage where you could see a bunch of here. I'm not able to share it. It's okay. So basically, what I was trying to share, and I might, if it comes up later, was that there is a ton of new publications, comic books, novels, young adult works, that stuff from Marvel, new Marvel superhero. There's also a lot of news about fashion. There's a lot of there's a tie-in with ethical fashion and indigenous brands. That's something we read about a lot in fashion magazines now, and of course, and we'll talk about that in more detail, is the coming of reservation dogs, which is very recent, but it's just such a joy, and it's such a brilliant, beautiful TV show. But I just wanted to say, are you both observing this? Is this an argument that this is would you agree with what I'm saying? Is there some kind of a shift in mainstream representation in the last 2-3 years or 5 years? Where are we with this?
There's definitely an influx of more Native American representation in a lot of spheres. I know there's a lot of great writing going on in the world of fiction, and especially youth fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Mainly because there's a support of educators that want that.
Mm-hmm.
So they promote it, and any representation, first and foremost, needs an audience. And so what's been hampering a lot of Native film representations is there's just no audience for it. There's the Native audience, there's community audiences, but in the end, Disney, Warner Brothers, they're not going to care to put something up that doesn't put butts in the seats, because their concern isn't representations. Their concern is that movie ticket getting sold, and putting in getting their money back that they put in. But to me, I can't really assess this until 5 years from now, because there's been fluxes of Native representations through the decades, and I want to see this take hold, mainly because I think it will. I think we'll have some staying power, mainly because I think the upcoming generations are smarter than us, and more aware of it. But people forget there was TV shows in the 80s and 90s and the 2000s that had Native representation in it, and now nobody can name those shows, unless it's attached to something like a Western. Everybody knows Little House on the Prairie. Everybody knows The Lone Ranger, and that comes to a very specified type of representation of Natives. So the idea of the good Indian versus the bad Indian in these circumstances. The good Indian being, of course, the one that helps the white people. The bad Indians are the Indians defending their land and culture in the shows. So people forget that there is a great show called Northern Exposure back in the 90s that had a great cast of Native actors on a regular basis. People forget that Tonto existed, despite the name of the name, and his subservient attitude was played by a Native person in a time of great segregation, in one of the first mediums in America, and he was playing a good guy. So those types of distinctions are lost on most generations these days. But it's going to take me a while to figure out if it's there or not. I love that it's there. Any native representation is a good thing. But for it to make an impact, we got to get the people that don't care about it to care about it.
Yeah, I think
that's the hardest struggle.
Yeah, the only pushback I would sort of say to that, I think, of course, there's television and there's a history of TV shows and films, but there's something new with like social media as well. I mean, you have these massive influencer Instagram accounts, you have these podcasts, you have these, and they're all, they are engaging communities. They are, I don't know. How can I just wonder if if we can think about those a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's definitely been an uptick, and it is in part the proliferation of media platforms, and so you can launch a podcast or a TikTok from anywhere, and folks certainly have. I think the only thing I would add, and Ernest, I'd love to talk Northern Exposure because that was when I was obsessed with that show, but I think there's also a way in which representation is a double-edged sword. And one thing I do like about the sort of more, some of the social media platforms in some ways, in that, representation in the US sits so snugly alongside this notion of inclusion. And I always sort of have this ongoing article or something in my head of death by inclusion. Because it's like a really short crosswalk between, I think, like representation in the quote unquote mainstream, inclusion into the broader narrative of like America. And that's a tough line to straddle, I think, of like when that turns into kind of a more pernicious form of assimilation. And then it also like subjects Indigenous Native stories to a larger degree of that consumer ethic of what is what's the will of the consumer, which in and of itself can be really assimilative. So I kind of like that, just some random teen somewhere in their res community or in city, wherever, they're just like broadcasting from their living rooms about their lives. And so that, I kind of like the insurgency of that. And I agree, like it's an uptick, but to me, Northern Exposure, I like, and maybe this leads us into Res Dogs. I see a real kind of connection there, trajectory maybe from Northern Exposure to Res Dogs, particularly in the kind of humor and the depictions of Native peoples outside of those bounds that Ernest talked about, in terms of either you're violent or you're vanishing, or you're tortured, or you're, it's just these, really cartoonish ways of depicting peoples. And they're much more kind of complex characters. I think more so in Reservation Dogs than Northern Exposure, but certainly in Northern Exposure.
Sorry, Greg, can I?
Oh yeah, okay.
Just before we go into Reservation Dogs, which is it's kind of mind blowing, right? And lots of thoughts on that. But I'm not an expert on fashion. Maybe Sandy and Ernest, you all don't feel you guys are experts on fashion either. But what does one think about like this new woman? Like it's there's so much stuff out there right now on the kind of Indigenous fashion stuff, and it just I think I'm coming out of thinking too much about like representations of African American women, and the kind of unevenness of how that pans out. On you treat X women a particular way, and then you depict them a particular way, and there's a kind of tension. And I just wondered, and connected to Reservation Dogs, of course, is the fact that I think it's Taika Waititi from New Zealand who is the Marvel kind of genius who's made all the Thor movies and things like that. And there too, he kind of inserts a very particular indigenous style fashion. He constructs that within it as well, even though these are Vikings and this kind of stuff. I don't know. Any thoughts on, I don't know, New Woman?
Such a complicated space, you know, like, and again, it's once you get kind of the interests of capital involved, it's so complicated. So like I can't remember the store that continues to sell like garbage as sort of native themed or motifs, or Urban Outfitters, you know, Pendleton blankets. I mean, sort of this notion of like what counts as native and indigenous. So there's that whole part of it. And then there's, you know, men and women who, you know, you look back in the earliest, you know, images of native peoples, and folks are always interested, just like any other community, in fashion or, you know, how they present themselves. And so, you know, there is also an implosion of women modeling in Vogue, and designers like Bia, what's her name? Yellowtail, that are entering high fashion. So, I mean, young people, you know, have desires to enter into the arts and fashion and go to FIT and be in New York, just like any other group of young kids. So I love seeing what they, you know, what they imagine, what they dream of. So it isn't, you know, and I do think that they transgress and play with borders in ways that are much more like nuanced than ultimately gets depicted, right? They can be on Madison Avenue and go home, you know, wherever that is in the span of a weekend, and not blink, because it's just life as an Indigenous person.
I had kind of follow-up question more specifically for Ernest. We mentioned, you know, those sort of new media and new technology, right? That sort of, I mean, make it maybe easier than ever to shoot movies. I mean, we've seen cycles of this as well. But you know, as the director of the First Nations Film and Video Festival, do you see a shift there? Like, in the people you work with, you know, maybe younger generations?
What I can tell you right now is that Native filmmakers have always been there. I mean, it's incredible to me that people say, "Hey, there's a resurgence of Native filmmaking." No, Native filmmakers have always been there. I mean, this film festival is coming up on 30 years, or over 30 years of being in existence, and I can tell you, every year that we've had the festival, we never had to show the same films again, because there's Native filmmakers out there. It does go a lot to the proliferation of technology. It's become a lot easier. But even when it was, you know, when they were filming on papyrus, there were a lot of filmmakers out there putting out their versions of what they felt, you know, represented them best. Again, it's about, you know, finding the audience for it. You know, we can put out as much stuff as we want. In any case, these days, it's about finding a community that isn't that beyond our own community. Is how I should put it. If we really want, you know, to educate and to shift this idea of what Native Americans are, because it's really tough to sort of you know, put up these films and then we only have an audience of 10 people, you know, because there's generally not a huge interest. Right now, there's a lot of exposure, but how is this all going to pay off in the end? Is how I'm looking at it. Because, you know, we can't consistently look at the now. We got to, you know, always think 7 generations ahead, right? It's like, how is this going to, you know, push forward not only representations, but all the incumbent issues that come with the things that we're talking about already. like you were talking about the boarding schools in Canada, and everybody's shocked at that. Natives were not shocked by that because they already knew about it, and it's just nobody's been listening to them all this time. They're finding footprints of indigenous people in Mexico, 20,000 years ago, and everybody's shocked at that. But Native people aren't shocked by that because they've been handing down these stories for millennia. It's really like I agree with Sandy. She said when she said representation like a double-edged sword, right? It's you're able to imprint on non-native audiences the things that you need to say, or it verges on capitalistic exploitation after a while. I've come across films and producers that really want their movies about natives to be in our festival, and I remember this one director in particular said he was the only hope for these native people to be shown anywhere. And I had to tell him, yeah, but we've already seen films about the Zapatista people or Zapatista movement in Mexico. People have been documenting it. In fact, the films that we showed, years ago were actually made by people within the Zapatista movement. And he really got upset, saying, well, I'm the only hope, it's sort of there's that shift in, how far are people willing to let this thing, be exploited? And some, it's funny, this first time our film festival is called Racist because brown people said no to a white person. And that's the ultimate power I think we do have as an indigenous people, is that we actually are starting to come into our own power to be able to say, yeah, no, don't do that. And it does upset a lot of tables, I can tell you that. But going back to the proliferation of social media, I think it's a great thing that more natives have access to this so they can put it out. I think that the time analysis, though, needs to be given its space too. That's why I like podcasts that are long, and you can have longer discussions about it. I was talking about this in my class the other day, because we were talking about the analysis of representations. And there's all these steps that you go through of, talking about the production of it, talking about the composition of it, talking about the context of it, talking about, how those signs and signifiers interact with each other to sort of convey the whatever representation that the creator wanted to. And all of the students were like glass-eyed because I just want to look at my TikTok. And they said, well, that's why it takes a lot of time to look at something, because you're supposed to take time to analyze it. But what you've noticed on the internet is that, the time for analysis gets shorter and shorter because the videos are getting shorter and shorter. And you'll notice there's a lot more reaction videos than anything on the internet, because reactions are not analysis, they're reactions. And so the idea of, analyzing something is starting to sort of be tossed out the window for shorter and shorter formats.
Ernest, you are getting to the core of all our woes.
Yeah.
as educators, as instructors, and I don't know, is the answer to just like put my lecture in TikTok form? I don't even know how that would work. But I wanted us to.
I'm not charismatic enough to be on TikTok, to be honest.
No, that's not true. Come on now. But Sonali Power, academic who teaches at the U of Minnesota, I think, has a lovely question. And I wonder if you all agree. TV audiences have splintered and focalized in the streaming era, though, she asks. So the consumer or audience for Reservation Dogs does seem narrower than Northern Exposure is perhaps more engaged. Yeah, I mean, in general, I think, Ernest, you're also moving us away from the question of shifts in representation, but actually it's a shift in who we are reaching, right? Like the distribution is the dissemination is what's altering. Maybe it's not necessarily the representation, though it's forced to
Well, what streaming has done is highly individualize the viewing moment. Back when Northern Exposure was on, there was only like 4 channels, right? Or 4 stations. So watching that show became sort of a community affair. You know, you sat down with your friends and your family, you talked about it afterwards, you talked about it the next day. With streaming platforms, you move on to the next one, you binge the next episode. Then when you're done with that series, you move on to the next
Right.
series. So
Yeah.
that shortened time of analysis and discussing this among community shortens. So then you put your thoughts on, you know, TikTok and hashtags, and that's probably the best way to talk about it, and it gets a more community-wide reach. So it's all just trade-offs on the same theme, I think.
Yeah. I wanted to dive into Reservation Dogs, and Sandy, you can start us off. But let me play the trailer just for fun, because we can, because they're just so great. And if people have, I hope I can interest them. We are huge fans. Greg and I are huge fans. I'm going to share my screen again, and let's hope this time it works.
Tell your friends. I don't have any.
Oh.
We'll get some then.
No. I don't know what happened. Why does my screen not share? This is like the new drama here. Chrome tab. Yeah, here it is. Okay.
It worked.
Tell your friends. I don't have any. We'll get some then.
We could be in California as soon as 2 months.
California, here it comes.
You and your boogie ass friends. What are you gonna fight for? Nah, I just I did. What? Oh, you guys watching this? It's gonna be like a month.
What kind of gamers go right into them?
Indie Mafia couldn't make up their minds if they want to be Bloods or Crips more. Maybe they're Blips. Or maybe they're Cruds. Hey!
It's easy to be bad, like the man. It's hard to be a warrior with dignity.
We're making it drop when the Glock go pop, pop, pop. Bullets can't be stopped. That let them in chop when the Glock go pop, pop, pop. You better believe we shutting down shop when the Glock go pop, pop, pop.
All right.
If you're over the age of 35.
Oops. Sorry. Did I bleep out for a second? Okay, so there it is. Absolutely, I think it's just so brilliant. And full disclosure, we actually invited Sterling Harjo, the creator, to come on this show, but he had to decline. He said he was very busy. I wonder why. Why is he so busy? Why are you so busy, Sterling? Anyway, so I just wanted, Sandy, I'll just directly ask you to comment on your experiences of watching the show. I know you were speaking about community engagement while making it, that you had heard very good things about the way it was produced with Native actors and so on. So your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I don't even know where to enter. So to Ernest's point, I binge watched it. And I'm thinking about what that platform does in terms of it sort of really individualizes the experience. It isn't like watching Northern Exposure is one of, I don't know, probably 5 shows that would be competing with it. But I'm wondering if that platform also enabled it to, because Northern Exposure, as great as it was, I mean, the lead character was really, Joel, the Jewish doctor from, the Upper West Side. So it still turned upon some very legible kind of white and non-native characters. And this really brings us into, I think the day-to-day life in their community, and so much of it resonates. I think the episode that folks like to talk a lot about is the one when they're in IHS, and just the familiarity of a lot of those characters. So you know, it's very much, you know, it takes place in the Muskogee Nation. I believe Sterling is part Muskogee, might be Muskogee and Seminole, I don't know. So it really, I mean, I think one of the reasons it resonates is because it is Native actors, and lots of the creative team is also Native and Indigenous. And the other part, because I'm so want to hear about what Ernest, as a filmmaker, says about it too. But to me, it's really the humor. It's with the humor and the dialogue, I think, that just is familiar and then really hasn't found its way to, I guess, mainstream, for lack of a better word, media. And that's probably new to a lot of people that are to sort of the non-native consumer. And it, you know, they just hit it on the mark so much, and I think that's what makes all the characters so real and endearing. And my favorite is Willie Jack.
Absolutely.
She cracks me up. Yeah, very familiar character. What's that?
Sorry, go ahead, Greg.
I
Sandy,
said, yeah, we
you're-
should start a fan club of Willie Jack. I think she's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, here's my controversial opinion.
Oh,
I haven't seen it.
you haven't seen it?
I haven't seen it. Mainly because as a film festival runner and seeing a lot of depictions of natives in films, and reading a lot of native fiction, I've seen and heard these stories before. Almost 70% of native people live in urban areas, off reservations, and the primary depiction of most natives is reservation natives. And I'm sure it's a great show. I trust Sterling Harjo with his representations. He's speaking from something from his own representation and tribal affiliations, because he is Muskogee. But I just know that the reservation's a horrible place, and the kids are going to have to do what they have to do to survive with a spirit guide. So I'm sure I'm going to watch it at some point, and I'm probably going to love it. And to touch on humor, native humor is very different from being funny, because people can be funny about almost anything. Natives are very humorous about the darkest stuff ever. They can make a joke about, you know, genocide, and it'll get a laugh because there's a resonance there. But to me, I find that most people sort of attach natives to humor as well. That's sort of like the upcoming thing, the new thing besides violence and banishment is another thing, is that the natives are funny. Sort of these different riffs of, hey, look, the Indian's eating a hot dog, sort of humor. I think that sort of began with native northern exposure to sort of pinpoint it, because there's a lot of, you know, weird acting natives in it. There were a lot of stoic natives that sort of were counter, that created a lot of the humor in the show. Then when Smoke Signals broke through, of how funny Thomas was, any non-native audience member that knows Smoke Signals will immediately start, you know, aping Thomas Fields of Fire, because they thought he was the funniest thing. And so when I speak to audiences, they're like sitting there waiting for me. He's gonna crack a joke. He's gonna crack a joke. And so I'm looking forward to watching it. And I want to. I'm not going to take detailed notes. It'll probably resonate with me because I did grow up on a reservation, but I also live in a large metropolitan city now, and as critically lauded as it is, it does not make it critic-proof. I don't think. I think a lot of the Native community is, well, not a lot. There's a vocal minority that is critical of the show, and we should, you know, at least give credence to some of the things they say about not being represented by the show. Another show that came out just recently was Rutherford Falls. Again, it's produced and written and has Native actors in it, and it gave Michael Grey Eyes a great career resurgence. Gina Schmedding, her career just took off from there. But again, it's like the Northern Exposure thing. It's like it's still viewed through the lens of a non-native main character. And Reservation Dogs is at least an entirely native cast. So it's a great starting point, I think, for what could come next. Hopefully they'll start to look for more native producers. I'm sure Taika has the world on his shoulders right now. And I know a lot of native producers out there have a lot of great ideas about where we can take this. Now I think a lot of native producers are just rubbing their hands saying, all right, now we can get to work. Now we can start telling this point of view of the story. I want to pitch to Netflix. Actually, I do have a pitch for Netflix. it's a native drama, a native K-drama set in Chicago. K-dramas are pretty popular, so it's gonna be a N drama, I guess. But it's done in that style of K-dramas, and it's basically just telling the story of two people living in the city. I think that would be a great hit. People forget Grant Avenue existed on HBO for a while, and that was urban nativeness. So it's a great. Again, these are all great first steps. That's why I always say I got to wait a few years to see if natives are going to be allowed to build on it. Because I can tell you, the filmmakers are out there. They're all out there and they're waiting. Now, whether they want to be part of the studio system is entirely up to them.
Yeah.
Because that does get exploited. But let's see where we go from here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me. We first met, centuries ago, I guess. At this point, I went to see the festival in Chicago, and meeting you was a surprise. I mean, we talked about a history I was not aware of, a history of modern Native American and urban history, right? And so you and Sandy are both educators as well. And so, I wonder, and you mentioned this earlier on, Ernest and Sandy, I want to ask you too. What place then is there, or is there a place in your own practice as educators specifically for films? And how do we? I mean, Ernest, you're more involved in again production and festival. Also, Sandy, I'm curious. How do you use films and actually as an open door to history that they don't necessarily depict, or what correlation do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I use film all the time as a kind of a different mode of storytelling that my students are really familiar with, and I think, storytelling broadly, thought in its most capacious term is an excellent pedagogical tool for so many reasons. But I want to kind of return, I guess, this notion of representation keeps as a thread kind of through this conversation, and I think one of the reasons why I have such a tenuous relationship to that construct is because, I mean, I think it to some degree it's a little unfair for everything to be representative of everything, and I think that's what kind of when representation becomes the demand, I think that's the kind of discourse that it invites. So like it's always about who's missing, who's there, what aspect, and like ultimately media and film, particularly, I was going to say particularly in forms of fiction, but that's not accurate because it's documentaries too. But I mean, everything gets flattened, right? Because you can never tell the whole story. And that's true of knowledge too. All knowledge is limited by, experience and so many other things, language, experience. So I think about this and then for Native peoples, when you're starting with the baseline of like erasure, I think what gets even more challenging is the universe or the Rolodex of, like, I don't know, stories that we have is so limited, again, to where that Ernest was saying. And so it has more, I don't know, salience in a way. Not sure. So in other words, when we see a show like Roseanne, is that really the life of working class white people? No. When you see, I mean, name any show, right? But that's one of like hundreds of shows so people maybe don't have the expectation for that one show to hit every single mark. And I think that's what gets hard about, the production of knowledge in Native and Indigenous communities, whether it's books or films or fashion or whatever. It's just really hard. And so one thing, and I haven't seen the last 2 episodes, and I'm looking forward to that, like 2.5, really. I'm in it. And there still is that notion of the reservation as a place to escape. But I think that they're going to continue to because since the beginning to the episode that I'm on, that has become more complicated, which I appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't this story of the reservation as just this. I mean, you see the quote unquote poverty, by which I mean, any community, stand in any community, that has its lifeblood sucked out of it by capital and settler colonialism. But the role of like, within that, there's humor, there's love, there's everything, that every teen sort of experiences, their little rivalries, or there's these very sweet moments all throughout that really, on some level, complicate and disrupt that notion of like the reservation as just this dire, horrid place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's always more complicated than that, right? And then I also think, there's also a real sort of queer component, both by the actors and directors and creators involved. And that somehow comes through, in ways I'm not, I just literally binged watch these. So not really able to articulate maybe how that comes through, but to me, it's very evident. I think Sidney Freeland, as a Navajo director, trans director, and there's, some of the actors identify as queer or Two-Spirit. And that really comes through. And I know some of the critiques are, have surfaced around, anti-Blackness, particularly we're talking about a Muskogee community, and there's lots of history there. And I guess I hope, like any team, production, creative team, finding their way, I just hope, well, one, I hope we get a whole nother slew of episodes or seasons. I don't even know how it works on Hulu. But that there's a whole nother season. I hope that folks are responsive to kind of the things that they've heard and about, that I think are there's lots of valid and interesting critique emerging. Mm-hmm. And I really look forward to where they go with it and what they do next. And that we have that sort of generosity of spirit about what they're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful, Sandy. I agree. And I think for the sake of this conversation, like what I'm seeing is that on one level, we're talking about the marketplace within which this goes into, and like the zillion problems that come with questions of market. And then second thing, of course, is the education space. And, to think about think about how we may, I don't want to say use, but how we may incorporate it when we teach what we teach, or how it could, how it could be brought in for like some other uses. I know education is of course tied to capital as well and to the market, but just in general, like the repertoire has suddenly expanded so much, So I guess I'm pressing once again on Greg's question. We're going to run out of time in like five minutes, just I forget how you phrased it, Greg, but just to think about all this stuff but how it might kind of be focalized within, as educators, what are we going to do with it? What are we thinking, about this?
So one quick story, and I forgot, Greg. Sorry, I forgot your question. I was rolling into it, and then I forgot about it. But Northern Exposure. We'll start there again, and then there's certainly plenty of other similar sort of scenes in Out of Reservation Dogs. But like, they did push against, and I've used that show so many times in my classes to help them to complicate the notion of capitalism as a logic or colonialism as a logic that is so kind of omnipresent, hegemonic, however you want to say it. And I remember this one episode when, what was her name? The character's name, Maggie, was desperate to have her own washing machine. And she was like, made this big deal about it, and she couldn't wait. And then like the purchase of it, and she was telling everybody, and people would be like, yeah, whatever. And then she got it. And then she had her own machine in her own home. And then she started to do and she realized that the trip to the one, town laundromat was more than washing your clothes. It was about, a place you'd get gossip, you'd catch up on your shows, all kinds of things. It was about the relationships that you had there. So then she started to invite people to come to her house to do their laundry, and they're like, no, I do that. And then I think she ended up returning it. It was such a long time ago. I think she ended up returning it and then going back to this like communal space. And, it just, for me anyway, becomes a tool to help. It's so hard for students. It's like asking fish to see the water that they're swimming in. And I think a lot of depictions of Native peoples and across various media platforms, provide an entry point for students to see the water swimming in, whether that water is modernity, or a sort of hyper modernity, or the liberal moment, or settler colonials, or whatever. It's been helpful.
Yeah.
The way I have been using film in my classes is I just show nothing but produced or directed things and have students write critiques of them, because I want them to analyze these things. And we head up against concepts of othering and concepts of the anomaly that sort of proves the rule for natives, that sort of thing. That's why I'm sort of I'm taking my time looking at Reservation Dogs, because to me this falls under the auspices of Philip Deloria's concept of the anomaly, where this is out, but it also sort of reaffirms all the biases that people have. And I'm sure, it's a great show, and I'm looking forward to seeing it, because I'm a big fan of Sterling Harjo. But what I've learned through all my years of education, and it's been reaffirmed many times, is that a lot of people don't learn about Native American history unless it's through movies, because that's the primary way that we've all been taught about Native Americans. And the most recent example I can think of is Hidden Figures. Even though there was a book out for years and years and years, nobody knew about the contributions of Black women to NASA until that movie came out. So it's, and we're right, these marketplaces are very capitalized, colonized spaces that we have to operate in. And that's the main difficulty, is because people view natives differently, because one, they were never expecting us to be here at this time. And two, what Sandy has been talking about, the idea of inclusivity, because we're such a tiny voice in the sea of voices. When the choir gets to singing, can you hear the native alto in it? And because the media right now is so saturated with streaming and TikToks, and it's just getting that native alto out there is seen. And I think Reservation Dogs is sort of that native alto, and that it's starting to reaching that decibel level of hey, that's something different, or that's something I haven't even looked at before.
Right. So we have vowed this season around. I love that we call ourselves seasons, to try to stick to time. And I just wanted to say two things before I hand it over to Greg, who plays us some music before we leave. Is that I would encourage whoever's watching to check out Ernest's Vimeo reel, which has those kind of very detailed, incredible breakdowns of the way in which films do the work they do the bad stuff, and how to kind of undo. And I liked kind of returning to, I've written and thought so much about representation in my own research, but it kind of return, and then have felt in the past few years a kind of lack of tools really to think through the extraordinary explosion on many fronts, TikToks or digital or whatever you want to call it, right? So I think it's great to return to some of Ernest's more baseline ideas. I don't know what that sound is. Maybe that's Greg. It's not clear. But anyway, all right, Greg, you can take it away from here. He's going to leave us with a few songs. And I just want to say that was a great conversation, and we didn't get to like 6 of the questions we had in mind, but that's just how it goes.
We can save that for part 2.
Absolutely.
All right. So is that thing visible? Yeah. Yes. Right. Okay. So we're going to start with this. It's a very fitting song by Aragon Starr. So she is an enrolled member of the Kickapoo Creek Nation tribe of Oklahoma, based in LA. She worked for Viacom and Showtime for a while before starting on her own career in art and entertainment. She is a playwright, an actor, and comic book writer, author of Super Indian. She's also a musician who recorded 4 albums in the early 2000s. Here's, we can only play for so long, but here's part of Please Do Not Touch the Indians. As you'll see, I think it's a pretty fitting song.
They put a white guy in tan makeup. They put a black wig on his head. It's no wonder we ain't on TV. They all think we're dead. They write songs, they make movies about Indians long ago. All the pictures never look like Indian folks I know. Please do not touch the Indians.
You'll have to go online if you want to listen to the rest of this. My second excerpt. So this is music by Tribe Called Red, or formerly the band formerly known as Tribe Called Red. And nowadays they go by the Hallucination. They're a crew from First Nations from Ottawa, Ontario. Current members are Tim Hill of the Six Nations of the Grand River and Aaron Thomas of the Cayuga First Nation. They first formed in 2007 with the idea of indigenizing the dance club by mixing First Nations music and electronic music. Along the years, they developed a style they call powwow step. This is an example of it, with lyrics by Prolific the Rapper, who emerged during the Standing Rock protests, which is, what his lyrics are about. So I'm going to play a little bit of that one. It's going to be loud.
The wind comes in 4 corners, 4 directions, 4 colors, and death rides on 4 horsemen. A black snake with some black paint. How much money do these companies need to make? They can track your product, but they wanna save a buck. Already extracted billions, when is enough? I used to be in the oil fields, getting paid, but I quit, cause oil water I can drink. Look down and come meet me, I die in the mud. Looked up and told myself that enough's enough. Money does not own my soul.
All of these are, easily findable.
Yeah.
On YouTube. There's another band, Sihasin. They're siblings, Clayson and Janetta Benally of the Indian Nation, based in Flagstaff, Arizona. They've been playing music since their teens in the early 90s when they formed a punk rock band. That was a trio called Blackfire. C. Hassan formed in 2012, and they've released 3 albums so far. Janetta is also a renowned dancer and cultural environmental activist. This song is called Shine. It's from the album Fight Like a Woman. Nice title.
Running years through the dawn, trying to find where I belong. Father sky awakens me. Feel the rain.
So it's a family affair. They often perform with their father on stage, which is really pretty cool, I think. And our final excerpt here is Superman. Christian Parrish Takes the Gun, aka Superman, Crow, Absaroka rapper and fancy dancer. He's been active in hip-hop since the late 90s, notably as a member of the crew Resurrection. In his music, he samples also traditional instruments and often wears his fancy dance outfit on stage. There's a story behind this. Apparently, at one early performance, he was coming back from a dance performance and didn't have time to take it off, and since it's become sort of a signature. He was involved also in the Standing Rock protests, where he performed on several occasions. Now, this is Know Better, Do Better.
Around the world, across the block, to head Leisure, where I get my chala. Reporting live from the universe, it's the First Nations MC. You could do the search, who been through the worst, surviving genocide, fighting for a better life. They try to set aside the true history and keep us mystical. They say they founded this country on biblical principles. It's so cynical, but I'm an analyst. It's murderous, they refer to us as specialists. Indian savages, now that's written in the Declaration of Independence. That's no kidding. Hey.
As he said, you can do the search, look them up. I think they're well worth it. And that's it for music.
Wow, great. that was a good. I feel like I'm echoing. I don't know why.
I don't think so.
All right, we can wrap up. Thank you so much, Sandy. Thank you so much, Ernest. I know it's a busy day for everybody. This was fun kickoff. And it will be on the Twitter, Facebook pages, and the YouTube of Warscapes. And huge thanks to Prithika for all the backstage work. Thank you.
Thank you all.
For coming.
Thank you.
Back soon. Bye.